Agnes DeMille is one of the great American women of the dance and the theater. It was she who turned the prim ballet of the concert stage into the rip-roaring, knee-slapping ballet of such hit Broadway shows as Oklahoma, Carousel, and Brigadoon, bringing dance to a wider audience than it had ever enjoyed. But despite the fact she was born into a certain amount of fame, Henry George, the great single taxer, was her grandfather, and the equally famous Cecil B. DeMille was her uncle, she had to struggle against formidable odds to achieve her own fame, now assured. The years of struggle are recorded in the 8 books she has written, the most recent of which is entitled Speak to Me, Dance with Me. Miss DeMille, one critic has commented about your work by saying it was full of fire, even funny, and entirely free of swans. You don't recall that, perhaps?
No, it is free of swans, though, that I can guarantee.
Yes, indeed it is, because you have made that transition from classical ballet to a kind of ballet which is, well, more indigenous to this country and more representative of the spirit of America. Why is it necessary to make that transition?
Why did I feel it was necessary for me to make it?
Right.
Well, because I couldn't do swans. They'd been done very nicely by my betters, my elders and my betters, and I thought it was high time that somebody did something else, and I personally had to do what I can do. I like swans, and I like the pure classic ballets. I like the abstract ballets. I would very much like to do ballets like George Balanchine. I can't. That's a fact.
So that turned you to ballets which drew upon the American experience.
Well, it turned, no, not immediately, although the first solo dance I ever did was this thing called 49, and it was just the hold down and the breakdown and time steps and things in a sunbonnet, and I had a certain quality, and John Martin, who was then the critic of the New York Times, said, I don't know whether to laugh or cry, but it makes me choke up, because it reminds me of things that happened before I was born. And so that was nice. Oh, and the best criticism I ever had was from Jacob Javits, who saw me do this, and he said, when you cross the stage and do this, he said, I know why I'm an American.
Really? You've done a great deal, and even more recently with your Heritage Theater in North Carolina, and drawing upon the folk music, the legends of America.
Everything.
Everything.
Yes. Well, now the thing is that we're the only country in the world that doesn't have a heritage theater, an indigenous folk theater. The only country. Ghana has 3, Mexico has 4, the Philippine Islands have 3 or 4. We don't have anything, and we have a marvelous heritage. It isn't just sunbonnets, you know, it's all of tap and jazz and all the marvelous Negro black forms and the ethnic forms and all our theater forms. And I thought it was time somebody did something about it, and I've always loved them.
Are we as Americans less interested in our heritage or less interested in dance?
We're very interested in dance, but like all colonials, we don't think we can do it well enough.
Oh, and we're still colonials.
I think so, very deeply. But the rest of the world disagrees, because our dances and our popular songs are what all the rest of the world is singing and dancing. I was in Vienna in October, and on every single taxi cab there was rock music with American voices singing.
You didn't say, when you were a child, I am told you wanted to act.
Oh, sure, I wanted to be a moving picture star.
Why a moving picture star?
Because all my family were in movies.
Of course. Your father was a writer in the movies, was he not? A playwright?
And a
William
director.
DeMille?
And a director. And Cecil, of course, was the director-producer.
And he was your uncle?
Yes. And naturally, and I could always cry at will and scream at will, and that's acting. So, you see, I didn't see why they wasted me.
But your father wanted you to be a writer.
Yes, he did. He wanted me to, first of all, to be a tennis player.
Why a tennis player?
Because he was one.
I see.
And I was trained by world champions. And I was pretty good. I had pretty good style. The only thing was I didn't care whether I won or lost. And of course that does make a difference.
You say about your father in one of your autobiographies that he wanted you both of you girls, to be boys.
I think he did. I never knew that until after he was dead. I found letters from him to my mother, and for the first 9 years of his life he referred to us as my boys, my sons.
And I suppose the tennis was somehow associated with that as well.
I imagine. And also he was opposed to actors and actresses. He wouldn't let them in the house. He didn't mind playwrights or directors. The only three actors that ever entered our home by invitation were Charlie Chaplin, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks.
Do you know why the exceptions were made in this case?
He thought they were no good bums, and I think that's extremely arrogant of him.
Yes.
Because the people I've met, he liked Walter Hampton, who was also, of course, a producer, but he wouldn't have them around.
Why did he make the exception with Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks?
Pure genius. He had to recognize that.
I see. Even if it was in the wrong field.
Well, he did doff his hat to Chaplin long before people realized. He said, this is one of the greatest talents we've got in the world.
It's said that you did take up an interest in dance, having seen Pavlova dance at the age of 8. Is this so?
Well, I did take it up. That's a fact. Yes, indeed I did.
What was it about Pavlova that made you want to become a dancer?
I don't know. I started crying and couldn't stop.
That wasn't part of the acting then.
No, I had to dance. And then he opposed that very, very strongly. He thought it was a form of circus acrobat. And I remember even when I was in college, I gave it up. I was allowed to take dancing lessons, ballet lessons, because my sister's arches fell, thank God. And she was taken to an orthopedist to have them lifted. And I went along and he suggested ballet classes. Well, what one sister did, the other one did too. And you see, with me, it was just dedication. It was like taking the veil or something. I went at it. And Miss Loy spoke in one of the sessions with you about Valentino's wife. I think she meant Rambova. That was my teacher.
I see.
And of course I was terribly in love with both my ballet teachers, naturally. And
by that time, thoroughly dedicated, I suppose, to dance.
Thoroughly, but I was forbidden to do more than a certain amount of practicing every day. And I disobeyed my parents, and then he got Kozlov, my teacher, to forbid me. And I had to do 2 hours at the piano and an hour of tennis, and then I was allowed to practice dancing. I don't know how I stood it.
Now, when did you first, having been trained in dance, begin to dance?
Well, I gave it up for college, you see.
Where was that?
UCLA, and took English. He wanted me to write
that. Was for your father's sake?
Yes, it really was. But then I got very interested in it. I met some extraordinary people there, some great, great teachers. And then when I was graduated, and I laid my diploma at his feet, I said, now I'm going to dance. Well, by that time the family was breaking up, and he was too distraught with his own heartbreak and various things. Mother and he separated, and it was a mess. And so I got on to dancing, but I was a little old for it by that time.
How old was that?
19.
And that's too old for dance?
Old for ballet, yes.
I see. So you never really felt that you had a fair chance at being a dancer?
No, but you see, I'm always angry. I'm always mad, and I always feel I haven't got a fair chance and everything's against me, and it turns out I'm always in the luckiest position possible, because marvelous things happen where I am. Not because of where I am, but I happen to be there. And I think possibly if I'd been a good classic dancer, I'd have been stuck in a company, and I never would have had to learn to choreograph, which I did have to learn to do.
I was struck with one sentence in your book in this same connection, where you say, this is the story of someone who got not what she wanted, but better than she deserved. Is that part of what you were just saying?
Yes, I think so. I'm a chronic complainer. I'm a real whiner.
Why?
I don't know. It's my nature. You know, surly.
You've also admitted in the book that you, when you were young, that you were a very moody girl, sullen and mean, sullen in the parlor and mean at school. Is that really so?
Oh, yes. But I had flashes of things. I had good friends, and occasionally I did things that were fun, and people recognized that too.
Was fun important to you? As it is to everybody, I suppose.
Well, fun for me was odd. Fun was making up dances, or making up plays, or practicing 4 hours Bach. That was fun. And of course it's unnatural in a way. I never played as a child.
And yet you said you had a happy childhood.
I did. And people say to me now, what do you do for recreation? Well, I write books. And that sounds awfully arrogant. It's perfectly true. I don't play any games, and that distresses my husband because he likes to play games. I live in such a competitive world all the time that I don't have to invent competition. It's built into my life.
Do you feel there's only half enough time to do what you want to do?
There isn't enough time, but I don't waste it playing games. I have just too much fun doing other things.
When did you first go to London
Well, we went as school children, first with my mother, and then we came back, and I went, this new book is about when I went in 1933 on my own to make my own way away from my mother, and absolutely on my own.
But the book is a series of letters to your mother, so you kept in very close touch with your mother.
Oh, well, yes. She was alone, and she loved me, and she was the one that behind my career and behind me. And I wrote to her long letters every week.
And you said in the book, she married me, and as a wedding gift, she gave me my career. She sacrificed financially in order to support you while you were in London. You were not earning your own way in London, despite the fact that you were dancing constantly.
Well, I couldn't, because they wouldn't let me. First of all, the Home Office wouldn't let me take jobs, and then I wasn't successful. That is, I was artistically successful to a degree, but I couldn't get a job. My first job was with Cochran, Charles Cochran, in the Gertie Lawrence show.
Tell me about Gertrude Lawrence. She was acting in this show,
She was the star,
which you were directing the dancing.
Yes. Well, she was just magic, absolute magic, but very difficult to work with, because she never did the same thing twice.
What was the magic?
Well, you know magic when you see magic. You're bewitched.
I see.
She was absolutely iridescent on stage. I don't know anybody who had her quality. She couldn't sing at all well, and she acted in a rather strange, heightened way. It wasn't realistic acting, it was fantasy acting. But it was bewitching. And while she was on stage, she couldn't dance. It didn't matter. And funny, oh my. And also she could touch your heart very deeply. And she was chic and lovely and beautiful, and she was very stylish. She set the style for clothes of her time.
You met a great many famous people in those years in London. You've met a great many since, but I think of those particular years, and Noel Coward was associated with this same performance, was he not?
No, just a great friend. He was a great friend of Gertie's.
And it was Cole, as you said, it was Cole Porter's music, so obviously you worked with him. But the one
I met Bernard Shaw.
That's the one I wanted to ask you about, because you described him as the sexiest man you ever met.
Oh, he was tremendous.
One doesn't think of George Bernard Shaw as a sex symbol.
Well, because you've read his letters and you've read too much about him. But when he bounded into the room, and there was absolutely, he was 70-odd, there's no other word. And his beard all crisp and white, and he was Pan.
Pan, I see.
P-A-N.
And you had lunch with him?
Yes, in his flat in London. And the conversation was just incredible. He never spoke until the conversation was ripe for the absolutely killing conclusion or sentence. His wife worked it up, and the guests helped. And then when he felt he was ready to say the thing, he gave the coup de grace, and it was memorable and carved in stone and dead also. Then you started another subject.
Almost as though it were staged.
Almost. She was the most marvelous second man I have ever heard work. And she'd always speak of him as GBS, what GBS said.
Did you meet John Dewey, as I recall?
Oh, he was a great friend of my mother's, because he was a devoted follower of my grandfather, Henry George. You know, he said, not since Plato have there been 7 greater philosophic thinkers.
And the followers of your grandfather, the single taxers, you've described as your chaperones.
Well, Mother knew that they'd keep a terribly watchful eye on me, and I had to escape their surveillance if I wanted any kind of young life, and I managed to, but it took a good deal of plotting.
Despite your association with them and your support of them, you found some of them rather dull people, I gather.
Well,
single taxers does sound as though they might be rather preoccupied with economics.
They're fanatics, absolutely besotted. But there were some great ones, like Lord Wedgwood, and some extraordinary ones, and Bernard Shaw was one for a time, you know. But the ones that I knew, dull in the sense, they were very fine thinkers, but they were one-track people. And really absolutely hooded on this, and that's always a little bit wearing. The Danish single taxers were much more fun, very much more fun.
What about your grandfather, Henry George? How well did you know him?
Oh, he died long before I was born.
That's what I was afraid of.
Yes, you know, he ran for the mayoralty of New York and dropped dead on the eve of election. It was very dramatic and tragic. Tammany later conceded that in a previous election he had been elected, but they stuffed all the ballot boxes and changed it, and he was materially influential in getting what we call the Australian ballot, or the the ballot we now use,
I see.
which came from Australia.
But I gather his determination was passed on to your mother and then passed on to you.
To a certain degree.
Yes.
It's still going. You know, there's a school, and we have all sorts of things. There's an underground movement. I think we better have some sense economically, don't you?
Yes, indeed. You left London at the invitation of your uncle, who up to that point had not provided any particular help to you in your career. None.
None.
And he invited you to come to Hollywood.
Yes.
And this was, I guess, the first real big job, in a sense, that you had. What happened?
Well, in Hollywood it was.
In Hollywood.
Well, doing a big Cochrane show is a good big job. I mean, for Europe and London it was big. And I'd made a success.
I just wondered, in terms of payment, he
didn't pay me anything much. He paid me $250 a week. It was a whole lot more than I'd been getting.
That's what I meant. It was a bigger paying job, and still not
in terms of Hollywood, that is paltry.
Yes.
And my fare one way.
One way?
One way. And I didn't have the wit to say I must have it returned. But anyway, it was to dance naked on the bare back of a bull. Well, I feel very uneasy with cows. And however...
That sounds like almost the stereotype of Hollywood, an almost unbelievable kind of thing.
But Cecil was like that. Cecil was stereotype, but he invented stereotype. And he believed it so completely and with such flamboyance that his pictures still stand as absolute top examples of their kind. And there are always marvelous things in them. What I think he failed to do, mind you, I haven't been asked, but given me the opportunity to say, is photograph men and women. I don't think he'd ever met any.
Any men and women, real people?
No, I don't think so. He saw them in terms of historic symbols. And when he did, let's say, the Exodus, I think it's moving to the point of tears. But home scenes of Moses and his mother, I think, are not so convincing.
You describe him so succinctly in your book. He kept sex, sadism, patriotism, real estate, religious and public relations dancing in midair like jugglers' balls for 50 years.
Well,
That's
he did.
quite a combination.
Well, he did. And he died rich, and he died successful, and he died very famous, and he's one of the few Hollywood figures that stayed at the top right through. And when he died, he had 6 pages of the Los Angeles Times dedicated to him. It's, you know, that's very unusual.
Well, the end of this particular story, if you're going to dance naked on the back of a bull, was not a particularly happy association.
No, he said I had no sex. The bull didn't seem to, well, I don't know. Anyway, there was a matter of, it wasn't a matter I could discuss naked under the searchlights in front of the entire company. If he thought I had no sex, I had no sex as far as he was concerned, but it hurt my feelings.
I should think it would. And so you returned to Europe then?
I returned to Europe.
When did you move from dancing into completely into choreography?
Well,
you had decided then that you weren't going to be a dancer. At some point you had decided, did you?
No, I was told.
I see.
And that was after I came back from Europe and was employed by Ballet Theatre, which is now known as the American Ballet Theatre, and I think it's the finest company in America, to do some choreography. And I said, fine, I will. And I'll do this for myself. And the gentleman who was hiring me said, you will not dance in it. You have to do something you won't dance in. And I said, I won't do it. And he said, listen to me. I've seen Fauquin make this mistake. I've seen Modkin make this mistake. You will stretch your talents and you will become a much bigger artist if you will work for somebody else. You're always working for your own body and your own personality, and it's limiting you. And he never spoke a truer word, nor did I ever listen to one. I didn't want to. That's again what I say. I didn't want to. I fought that. But I had to get outside of myself and see what a really well-trained body could do and what somebody who didn't have my particular knacks. I'm a good comedian, for instance. I had to work with somebody who wasn't such a good comedian and put it into the gesture. And it did stretch me out.
Yes. How do you bring this about in working with others and get them to
Oh, that's
perform?
a long process. I think
slow process?
Long and slow and tedious. And I have to think it through my own body first, you know, and do things. And then I get a chosen few who know me pretty well, and I know them. And we lock ourselves away secretly, and I just try things out hour by hour until I get a piece of movement that looks quite wonderful and effective and rhythmic and, you know, with a beat in it.
Does it have to feel good as well?
Yes, always does.
Yes.
And then I said, that's that. And then when I get enough of them, then I have building blocks, so to speak. And I have my vocabulary for the new dance. And then I put it on the dancers who are going to do it, and then I redo it, and redo it, and redo it. Jerry Robbins.
Does that mean it's never finished?
Oh yes, it's sometimes finished. I'm never quite satisfied, but sometimes I just leave things alone that I'm not satisfied with because I just have got to stop fussing and tampering. Jerry Robbins said to me, you know, I work the first 3 days on something, and I go in prepared, and it doesn't matter if I prepare 6 months. The first 3 days are just garbage and have to be thrown out. And he said, why can't you do the first 3 days before you go into rehearsal?
Yes. But it's just a stage you have to go through.
Well, you see, the big good things come instinctively. They come almost by accident. But you can't count on this, and you never get them if you haven't done the slugging work before.
Yeah. Was Rodeo the first big success in this respect?
Yes, it was. And it was a real, true success.
And it was done with the Ballet Russe.
Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo during the war, and we got 22 curtain calls at the Metropolitan Opera House the opening night.
And with European dancers. Was there any difficulty?
No, they weren't.
They weren't.
So many. There were a great many American and Canadians, though they had Russian names. And the reason I was permitted to do it was because we were in war, and they suddenly decided it would be a very good, patriotic, and timely thing. Popular, you see. If they did an American ballet on an American subject by an American, this was the bizarre aspect, because generally it had been done by a Russian. And so they came to me and said, did I have an idea? And I didn't. But I said, of course I do. And then I thought hard for 2 days and came up with this and got Aaron Copland, demanded Aaron Copland, and we got to work. And it's about writing and so forth. A lot of the work I'd prepared in London before. And I showed it to the people. It's very difficult to do. Very difficult. And the Russians said, this is not dancing. And I said, I didn't say it was, but this is what you're going to have to do. And they just left the room all block. So that left the Americans and Canadians.
And you could teach them about...
They were willing to be taught. And those men never moved like that. I tell you, when they hit the stage that night, there was a roar from the house. There really was.
There was.
I'm not exaggerating.
And the cast itself, I suspect, was very excited about this kind of
tremendous.
dance.
And the men in the pit playing the score for the first time. You know, it's a very fine score. It's become American tradition.
Yes, of course.
Well, they're standing up, you know, beating with their bows on the strings. You don't get the Union boys to do that. It was an extraordinary night.
What about the night that Oklahoma opened?
Well, you know, it wasn't so much of a success.
It wasn't?
No, we couldn't fill the house. Not nearly. I knew it was going to be something of a success because of the Boston success. And so I'd bought 10 tickets, I think it was, or maybe it was 8, in the front row of the balcony. You could afford them then. It was $2.50 each, or maybe these tickets were $2. And I was getting $50 a week at that point. But I did, because it was a splurge, it was a gala. And then I couldn't find people to put in them. I went out onto 44th Street and dragged in some dancers that were loitering and said, you want to see an opening? And they weren't averse, so they came in and sat down. And the press wasn't all that much the first night.
Why?
I don't know why. Brigadoon's press was better. But this rolled up. My goodness me, what happened?
Yes.
2 days later, 3 days later, the queue was around the block. And I went off to get engaged to a soldier and came back and was being interviewed by somebody from the New York Times, and he said something, and this man said, I don't think, Miss DeMille, you realize what kind of a success this is that you've participated in. And I said, well, never having had a real one, I said, what kind? He said, probably the biggest in the 20th century. And I said, well, for goodness sakes. You know, my salary didn't change. Nothing changed for me.
You've not made a great deal of money out of this.
Not out of Oklahoma, I haven't. Very, very little. But the contract stuck. I mean, it was I was first signed to do for $1,500, no royalties, all rights given up, all. And then Dick Rogers heard about this, and he thought that was not quite fair, so he arranged for me to get $50 a week. And then after the Times man said this, I went to the Theatre Guild and said to Lawrence Langdon, I'm going to marry a soldier on pay, you know, private, no grade, and he has no money, and I have no money, and I have 10 years of debts. Do you think you could make it $75 a week? And he said, no, I couldn't. And so they didn't. So that was that. But then I did have, of course, chances to work other places.
What has been important to you, Miss DeMille? You came from a famous family, so it can't be entirely fame, which you now enjoy. Money, which you've not always been able to
Well,
get.
I did get some, you know,
Yeah, so of
but the
course.
government took most
What
of
has been important? Just the chance to do what you wanted to do?
that. And do you know that's the most precious thing in the world? I don't think I've ever in my life had to work at something I despised. And now you ask how many people that's true.
I suspect very few.
I mean, I see so many businessmen and people in the business end of the theaters. I love what I'm doing. And when I went down south to do this heritage company with these children in a gymnasium and young kids, I worked for nothing. So did they, poor things, but they were students. To see the ideas flower on their faces and in their bodies, and I'd say, stop, do it this way and on this count, and there'd be a yell from the kids because they got the idea. Well, now look, this is just heaven. This is very great.
Thank you very much, Miss DeMille.
That's all, folks.